Today we're looking at Magnus Carlsen's most spectacular game from the 2024 Speed Chess Championship Grand Finale, in which he obliterated Alireza Firouzja's King's Indian defense with a highly unconventional opening approach, throwing Alireza off his game, leading him into a completely alien landscape, and giving him difficult problems to solve with not nearly enough time on his clock to do so. He just can't seem to navigate that narrow and elusive path to survival while under the unearthly pressure that Magnus constantly applies. If this isn't a masterclass in how to dominate at blitz, then I don't know what is, but let's get right into it. Magnus kicks things off with d4, second best by test, and we head straight down the main interstate of King's Indian territory, an opening where white is allowed to get his big center, which black will seek to undermine later on. This is known to lead to extremely unbalanced positions and can be a great way to play for the win as black or white. We have e5 from Alireza striking in the center, all still mainline theory. White, of course, cannot win the pawn on e5 due to the discovery by the bishop on g7 after knight takes e4. Magnus now castles, and h6 now from Alireza, being the first to take an exit from that mainline King's interstate and leading Magnus down a bit of a side alley with this h6 move, which you won't see being recommended in any classic chess books on openings, but the engine actually thinks it's not bad, and it has some logic to it in that it deprives white's bishop of the g5 square. So if white were to play bishop to e3, you can harass that bishop with knight to g4, and there is no bishop to g5, which would be good for white if it were possible. So instead, you have to make the sad retreat, going back from whence you came, unless giving up bishop for knight is something that you're into. I mean, there are weirder proclivities out there. But anyway, played by Magnus is rook to e1, indirectly supporting the center, now knight b to d7, and bishop to f1, directly supporting the center. Rook e8 does the same, and now rook to b1, supporting a b4 thrust. The goal here is to play d5 and be ready to deprive black's knight of the c5 outpost. And if you're wondering why not just play b4 first, well then black would play a5, and you'd like to play a3, but you can't because there's a takes b4, exploiting the pin on the a pawn. So this is why Magnus starts with rook to b1, getting off of that file, and also off of the long diagonal where the dark squared bishop is lurking. Now black can still prevent white from establishing a pawn on b4 with this move a5, which is what Alireza now plays. And it's a move that causes Magnus to reject the d5 plan altogether. If white were to play it here, then the knight settles into c5 and it ain't going anywhere. Because if you try a3 now to prepare b4, black can respond a4. And is going to be there to capture the pawn en passant if it is pushed to b4. So Magnus decides to take the game into a completely different direction. After a5 from Alireza, he captures on e5, which is not really typical in these King's Indian positions, and the engine is not super impressed either. It actually likes b3 followed by rook to b2 and then headed over here somewhere. Such an engine thing to want to do. But after d takes e5 from Alireza, Magnus plays queen to c2, and despite the pawn symmetry here, he is going to be creating some imbalances and posing some difficult questions to Alireza, who is now in what is probably some quite unfamiliar territory. Going for this kind of position as white is not nearly as popular as pushing the pawn to d5, where it would control e6, preventing a black knight from arriving there via c5, where it would be controlling some nice dark squares. On the other hand, without the pawn on d5, that square is potentially available for the white knight, which is just one move away from landing there. Of course, there is this move c6, now played by Alireza, rendering knight to d5 utterly impossible, which I'm sure Magnus saw coming. So what's his plan here? Well, there is actually only one move in this position that maintains any hope of an advantage for white. Everything else just equalizes. Pause the video if you like, try to spot white's best move, which is in 3, 2, 1, knight to a4, threatening c5, which would gain space and cramp black's position even more than it already is. Now you can challenge that pawn on c5 with b6, but then the pawns get traded and you're left with these weak split pawns. So what to do as black? Well, what you need to do is switch plans, which is typically kind of psychologically difficult for us humans to do. And this is what Magnus does. He poses difficult problems that have solutions, but in a blitz game especially, you're probably not going to find the right path, which in this position is to relinquish control of d5 and play the move c5, which Alireza probably just couldn't wrap his mind around, just assuming that knight to c3 headed for the promised land on d5 is just not something you want to let happen. And this would have been bad a couple moves ago, but here it's actually okay. And the reason is that white has wasted a couple moves putting his knight to a4 and then back to c3. So black is able to get away with moving his own knight around a little bit. To f8, going to b8 would work also. And then after knight to d5, you got knight to e6, headed for a promised land of your own on d4. And black has equalized. It's a pretty symmetrical position, and you can't really make the claim that one side is any better than the other. But transitioning into this new reality of c5 being the right move was just way too much for Alireza, and in this position, he played knight to h5 instead, headed for f4, which is often a very good maneuver, but in this position, it does not prove to be very effective. Now Magnus could just immediately play c5 here, but he throws in bishop to e3 first, also good, preventing c5 from black. And if b6, we're going to play c5. And if b5, we play knight to b6, all great for white. So Alireza just goes ahead with knight to f4. It's cosmetically very nice, but the knight is not really going to do much there. White's light squared bishop is very well placed here, defending the g2 pawn. Magnus now places his rook opposite the black queen, pinning the knight on d7, which Alireza immediately remedies with queen to e7. And now we get that oppressive move c5 from Magnus, locking down the queenside pawn structure. Alireza now tries knight to f8, giving the light squared bishop a diagonal and looking to redeploy to e6, but that is not going to be nearly as effective without the pawn on c5 to support the jump into d4. But spoiler alert, the knight never even makes it to e6. Magnus now infiltrates with knight to b6, which would be the strongest move in the position if not for bishop to g4, sacking the exchange in order to capture on f3 and weaken white's kingside pawn structure, which Alireza is not going to play, which means that practically speaking, knight to b6 did end up being the strongest move for Magnus to play. And I should point out the bishop to g4 is still losing, just not as severely as the move Alireza played, which in this position is rook to b8. And here, Magnus makes what I'm going to call a masterful decision. And it's not the best move, not even close. The engine's giving rook to d6, and in a classical time control, you might even call the move Magnus plays next a mistake, but in a blitz game, the decision to play knight takes c8, eliminating Alireza's light square bishop, is extremely practical. Now he never has to calculate any lines with bishop to g4, or weaken himself with h3 to prevent that move, and after the rook takes on c8, Magnus continues with rook to d6, a multi-purpose move, eyeing the king side, preparing to possibly double the rooks, blocking the black queen's access to the c5 pawn, which in some lines can be targeted with the help of a knight on e6. So a very nice move, not the best. The engine said knight to d2 headed to c4 right away was stronger, but rook d6 is going to work just fine because finding the correct response as black is no easy task. And it's not going to happen in this blitz game where Alireza should now just vacate his f4 post with knight to e6 and just try to hold the fort down. But Alireza is not one to play passively, and instead he goes for b6, trying to undermine the rook's position. Of course, if you take on b6, you're losing the rook, but Magnus just ignores that and plays bishop takes f4. Which again is not the best move due to a subtlety in this position, which is not surprisingly lost in the fog of blitz, and that is, instead of recapturing on f4, Alireza can first throw in b takes c5. The white rook is under attack, and white will have to take a move to defend that rook. The engine's suggesting queen to d2, so it would be better for white if he could just play bishop to c4 immediately, but the rook needs to be defended. So let's contrast that with what was played in the game by Alireza, which was the immediate e takes f4. This allows Magnus to play e5, a very strong move and a more ideal way to defend the rook. And so after Alireza's b takes c5, the rook is protected and Magnus is able to play bishop to c4 immediately, pinning this f-pawn with the potential to take on g6. The engine's even giving some lines where you can sack the exchange with the winning attack. But after Alireza's next move, rook e to d8, Magnus now defends the rook with the queen. And here, with the pawn on e5 and no rook on e8, this move is stronger than in the line we just looked at. And it's now the ideal way to defend, better than rook to d1. Because if black were to capture on d6 and you recapture with the pawn, then you can get that rook into e7 with a big disaster coming on f7. So Magnus knows that it's good to keep his rook on the e-file. We have g5 now from Alireza, trying to get some counterplay with g4. Magnus just shuts it down with h3. We have knight to g6, threatening to capture the pawn on e5. So Magnus counterattacks with rook to d1, tripling up on the d-file, threatening to win a piece. Alireza captures on d6. We have e takes d6, hitting the queen. She goes to a7, which is kind of an ugly square, but you got some pawns that need defense. a5 was hit. Magnus continues now with the strongest move, queen to d3, threatening to win the knight on g6. The pawn on f7 is of course pinned, and Alireza responds knight to f8, guarding some weak light squares and adding some coverage to that square in front of Carlsen's passer. And if it were black's turn to move again, he could play queen to d7 and blockade. White would probably still win, but the task would be much more difficult. But it's Magnus's turn to move, and he plays rook back to e1, threatening that deadly penetration into e7. So Alireza goes into crisis mode here. It's time for damage control with rook to d8, so that after rook to e7, which is a double attack, he can play rook to d7. He's just accepted that this f-pawn is going to fall. Magnus takes it out with check, the king goes to h8, and we have the rook exchange on d7. The bishop on f7 is now hit, drops back to b3, which creates the nasty threat of queen to c4, followed by queen to g8, checkmate. So Alireza is going to need to prepare a defense to that before the queen gets to c4, so he plays knight to h7. Headed for f6, and after queen c4, we have queen to d8 first, defending g8, and getting out of the way of knight to e5, which will be possible after the knight goes to f6, blocking the bishop. Next is queen to e6, allowing Alireza to grab the pawn on b2. He now has a passed c-pawn, which always looks good on paper, but it's not really of any consequence here. d7 from Magnus, threatening queen to e8, which at first glance looks like the end of the road for Alireza, but it's really amazing just how long he's able to hold it together. He is an incredible defender. We have knight to f6, covering e8, threatening to win the pawn. So how do you proceed as white? Has Alireza just swindled Magnus out of his hard-earned win? Of course not. Magnus is just going to keep creating new threats. It's never going to stop. He plays knight to e5, threatening a fork. The knight must be taken out with bishop takes e5, and after queen takes e5, the knight on f6 is pinned. Can't capture on d7. Neither can the black queen, as she's tied down to defending the knight. What a predicament. Alireza tries king to g7, defends the knight, and so threatens to capture the pawn on d7. So bishop to e6 is adding defense. We have c4, the passer going rogue, hoping to be the hero of the game, but Magnus simply plays queen to d4, centralizing, adding defense to the d7 pawn. If c3 is played, he can just capture, maintaining the pin on the knight. So Alireza now breaks the pin with king to f8, threatening to get into e7 and help win that d-pawn. Magnus is having none of that. He executes a check, driving the king away. You can't play queen to e7 because then the pawn will queen with check. The black queen is pinned and cannot capture. So king to g7 is forced. Magnus takes the pawn on c6, giving double protection to his pride and joy on d7 and threatening queen to c8, to which there really is no defense. But Alireza doesn't throw in the towel just yet. He's got one more trick up his sleeve, which doesn't work, but it's worth a shot. He plays g4, trying to create a last-minute miracle. And here, Magnus could just play queen to c8 and be totally winning, but then Alireza has queen to b6. And if you queen the pawn, he'd have queen to b1 check. King goes to h2, but now g3, will force the king onto the g3 square. After f takes g3, f takes g3, king takes g3 is the only place to go, and this runs into queen to e1 check. And although white can escape endless check here with the move king to f3, this is far from obvious in a blitz game. No human, including Magnus, is going to be able to calculate all this out with such a limited amount of time, and there's no reason to, when you can just avoid all of this with the move Magnus played in the game, which in this position was simply h takes g4. Just eliminating that whole variation, the king can now hide safely on h2. We have king to f8 from Alireza, threatening to go to e7 again, so Magnus has to take a move with queen to c5 check, got to go back to g7, and now comes queen to c8, which was the last move of the game. Alireza lost on time, probably searching for some last-minute trick which did not exist. So there you have it, a true blitz masterpiece and a masterclass in how to win at blitz. Keeping it simple, depriving your opponent of any chance of counterplay, even if that means avoiding the top engine move when it leads to a messy position. So thanks for watching to the end of this video. That always helps the channel, and so does your liking and subscribing if you want to be notified of more videos like this coming your way soon. I'll see you next time.